Chapter 76, Masquerade. Masquerade. It was curiously simple thing to bring about, Frithha having 2 tickets to the opening night of the playhouse sent out to Dirl with her best wishes for St. Aldulfi's Day, and after a day of tense waiting, the very next morning a fine invitation of thick bleached vellum decorated in gold and inks arrived for her and a guest. Higold nearly wept when she asked him to accompany her. Backstage was busy even when compared to its usual air of industry, actors and stagehands all hurrying back and forth as Higold shouted orders from the stage. Jahara flattened herself against the wall as the pale old Alhina glided past with a wide basket of bobbins, threads of every color unraveling within. The arrival of the invitations had suddenly set everything in motion, the rest of the morning spent planning their evening in infinitesimal detail before Frithha danced over to the 5 flagons to arrange things with Higold. Win and Mayan had managed to find some old tunics and jerkins in the costume hamper, the servants of some long-forgotten household, the pair working to repair and alter them. As luck would have it, it was customary for houses who held such gatherings to provide a similar if somewhat simpler celebration for the servants, so arriving with an increased company of help would not seem as unusual as it could have. Valigar, Cerned, Anomen, and Jahara herself had been agreed as the ones who would be accompanying the pair, Frithha working on the theory that though the local nobility may recognize Anomen or Valigar, the local servants probably wouldn't. Jahara turned back to the open doorway next to her, Anomen on the other side of it as they both watched Frithha rooting through a large costume hamper set against the far wall, the girl pulling out petticoats and bloomers of various sizes and conditions.
Well, it is too late for you to have a dress made,
Jahara mused aloud as she watched Frithha heave out and promptly discard what looked to have once been a large frilly nightdress.
I suppose we could try and find you something at the promenade before the stalls close for the day.
Don't worry, the girl huffed, bent double once more,
I've a dress.
Jahara and Anomen shared a frown, the night venturing,
I mean no offense, my lady, but you cannot just borrow one from the actresses this time. I know,
Frithha countered archly.
Will you both stop fretting? I told you I'm sorted for a dress. Aha, this should do.
She cried at last, straightening to pull a long strip of boned panels and yellowing lacing from the hamper. Jahara frowned.
A corset? Why onto real do you need one of those? For my dress, I don't think it will hang right without one.
Frithha sniffed at it tentatively, her nose crinkling as she immediately turned her face away, and Jahara suspected it was hardly fresh after its time at the bottom of a musty old hamper.
Well, I'm sure it will be fine after an airing.
The girl persevered, leaving the chaos of clothes still strewn about her and turning to pick her way delicately back to the door, raising her voice as she called along the corridor.
Right, Higold, I'm heading back to the coronet now, are you all right to arrange a carriage for us? Yes, my lady,
assured the man himself as he dashed into corridor to answer her,
not to worry. And I shall have the tunics and whatnot sent over once Win has finished making the alterations. Wonderful, give her my thanks, won't you? Oh, and Jenna said she would lend me some shoes. Yes, she had to return home to fetch them though. I shall have them sent over once she arrives back. Oh, to think I am to spend the evening in the company of Athkatla's most influential citizens!
He cried, looking suddenly enraptured.
This is such an opportunity for the theatre, I'll warrant Bethseda over at the Crown will be green with envy.
Jahara raised an eyebrow at Frithha. The girl had assured her she had informed Higold that they may have an ulterior motive for wanting to visit Dirl's estate, though she clearly had not given the man any further details of this and, for his part, as long as he got to attend the party, Higold seemingly didn't care.
Yes, well, I'm sure you've lots to do,
prompted Frithha, Higold assuring her he had as he heard his cue and bustled off shouting for Mek.
And are we ready to depart, my lady?
asked Anomen. Time was pressing.
Just one last thing,
the girl trilled as she nicked back into her office to reappear an instant later with a plain drill bag.
There, done.
Cern glanced up at the sound of the door. The small group of familiar figures headed by Fritha as she, Jahara and Anoman returned from the theatre. The fact he was sat alone in the tavern and nursing the same cup of ale as when they had left him, causing a definite flicker of concern on more than one face, though there was no question of it as they arrived.
Well, it's all arranged,
Fritha announced blithely, hefting her many bags back onto her shoulders.
The carriage will collect us just after the 6th bells.
Cern nodded his thanks, trying to force a smile as all his fears were finally given a deadline.
Right,
the girl continued after another wary pause and sending a cursory glance to the windows where the dusk was threatening.
Well, time is getting on. I suppose I should go and attempt to make myself presentable.
Anoman muttered something inaudible and followed her, Jahara sighing as she sunk into the chair next to him, a frown that was usually reserved for Fritha furrowing her broad brow.
Cerned, are you well? You seem tense. I was going to say upset. Do you have reservations regarding the plan? It is not too late if you wished to continue gathering more evidence on Durrell and perhaps try to gain custody of Asdale by more official methods.
Cern just shook his head, lifting his cup for another warm sour mouthful.
No, this city will never award that child to my care, especially not if they came to learn what I am. And how would they?
Jahara cried, almost frantic as she grabbed his sleeve.
Cerned, look at me. What is wrong?
He stared back at her, those angled hazel eyes piercing right through him as though she could actually see the twitching anxiety of his heart. So much was resting on that night's plans, much that he was still unsure of, and his desire to somehow thwart them himself was palpable, a sure and final end to those past few days of torture. And yet, that minute spark of hope just would not allow it.
I am fine, Jahara, just worried about tonight and what we are to do. If you will excuse me, I would like to return to my mediations before the moon rises.
The woman kept hold of his sleeve a moment longer before she relinquished him, leaning back in her chair with a defeated sigh, and he felt her eyes on his back long after he had left the common room. Ari walked swiftly down the hallway, a bundle of foamy white muslin tumbling over one arm and swinging with her gait. She had just left Cerned, the man still in his room making his meditations and giving the appearance of ease, but she could tell he was nervous and he was not the only one. Tensions were building in their small group as the hour closed upon them, and Ari wasn't sure which was worse, knowing you would have to go and play a part in a task upon which so much was resting, or knowing you were to stay behind and just spend a torturous evening waiting. Ari reached the door, knocking briskly and putting her face to the wood to call, "Fritha, are you decent?"
"Gods forbid, no,"
laughed the voice on the other side, Ari opening it to find the darkened room surprisingly tidy considering the chaos that usually accompanied such preparations. The window was slightly ajar and rattling in the rising wind. The corset Fritha had rescued from the theatre hung before it airing, while a small saucer of incense burned on the floor beneath, the frail tendril of smoke curling up towards the worn arrangement of bones and canvas. And the room was colder for it, not that Fritha seemed concerned. The girl sat at the dresser in only her slip as she was. Every lantern in the room had been set upon the counter before her to give the best light as she preened in the mirror, the rest of the room consumed by shadows, and Ari cast about her in the gloom for some sign of the so far fabled dress the girl had sworn she possessed.
"I brought my petticoat as you asked,"
said Ari, giving up her search and laying the thin layered garment out on the bed behind her, wondering if Fritha planned to go in that alone. Fritha's reflection sent her a smile.
"Oh, thank you, I was just finishing off my cheeks,"
she explained. Ari glanced to the soft sable brush and the small pot of vibrant carmine powder the girl had held in each hand to confirm.
"You're wearing rouge."
Fritha turned to her, the apple of each cheek warmed to a rose-pink blush.
"Yes, just a little, can you tell?" "Well, no, not really,"
the elf conceded.
"You've merely a healthy glow, like you've just had."
Ari stopped herself at the last moment.
"Some really good news,"
she finished weakly. Fritha gave her an artless smile.
"Really? I don't know about me, but Cern certainly has. Either way, it will be amusing to see if a nomen notices." "A nomen?"
Ari repeated, wondering how he came into the matter, the girl laughing as she nodded.
"Yes, I can just hear him now, my lady, you look like a common prostitute."
Ari smiled, listening to Fritha still giggling as she rose to take up the petticoat and moved behind the screen to change. Ari crossed to the window and drew it shut with a protesting squeak, her attention caught for a moment by that dark blue city beyond the glass before it drifted up to the corset hung above her, the yellowing canvas now heavy with the scent of sandalwood and oranges, the faintest trace of mildew still lingering underneath.
"How is it?"
Ari asked, turning back to the plain dressing screen, Fritha's disembodied voice answering her.
"Fine, actually, I thought it might be a little tight."
Ari smiled, Fritha stepping around the screen dressed in the petticoat the girl had bought for her so long ago, black stockinged feet almost blending into the floorboards and giving her the appearance she was floating as she smoothed out the many layers of frills that made up the wide frothy skirts.
"It fits you well. It is a touch loose on me. I always meant to take it in, but I never got around to it, and I suppose it is fortunate I did not." "Ah, you're in here, Ari,"
came a voice behind her. Ari turning to see Jahara marched through the door, knocking clearly something other people did.
"There is a girl, Annalise, downstairs looking for you. She said something about bringing her tortoise-shell ones." "Oh, it's the combs for your hair, Fritha,"
Ari cried, half turned to go and greet her friend.
"Annalise is one of the illusionists. She has such long dark hair, always worn up with all sorts of pretty combs and pins, so I went back to the circus while you were bathing to ask if she had any we could borrow."
Fritha beamed.
"Oh Ari, that's so kind, thank you, and thank Annalise for me too,"
she called after her as the elf swept out, Fritha drifting over to the window to take down her corset and turning back to the woman still left.
"Are you fine to help me with this?"
Jahara nodded, taking from her unresisting hands to begin to loosen the laces, casting about her as she did so.
"So where is this dress of yours then?"
Fritha smiled almost wistfully, moving back around the screen to appear a moment later with a deep green gown over one arm, the girl laying it out on the bed behind them, and in the gloom it could have almost been a young woman taking a moment's rest before she was called downstairs to her carriage.
"Nalia gave it to me,"
Fritha said quietly.
"It is very beautiful." "Yes, shame it's me who's going to be wearing it,
Fritha laughed, giving the woman a nudge. Jahara just smiled and shook her head, giving the corset in her hands one final tug.
"There, that should be loose enough, now put your arms up."
Fritha followed her instructions, the woman placing it over her head and tugging it down past her shoulders until it was resting loose around her torso, Jahara already at her back, working to retighten the laces and muttering all the while.
"Really, why some women must insist on forcing themselves into such unnatural shapes, right? Are you ready? Now, hold on to something."
Fritha nodded, leaning forward to awkwardly grasp the windowsill as the druid worked down her back, tightening as she went and keeping taut the loops of slack on her spidered fingers like some strange game of cat's cradle.
"Come on, Jahara, put your back into it,"
Fritha teased, the woman's only reply a vicious tightening of the laces that left her breathless.
"There, how is that?"
asked Jahara finally, the woman sounding quite worn out for her efforts.
"Perfect,"
Fritha gasped affectedly, grinning as she crossed to examine her reflection, her narrow frame now even slighter while her chest was flattened behind the corset's front panel, a solid triangle of whalebone that ran from the top on her chest, the point coming to rest just below her waist.
"Goodness!"
She laughed, rapping lightly on the heavy boning.
"This could stop a crossbow bolt. Here, help me with the dress, I can't bend in the middle now."
A few moments struggling and they were back before the mirror, Fritha now glorious in dark green silk, the rough weave shimmering dully in the light of the lamps. It was a simple dress, much belied by the opulence of the fabric, just a long narrow bodice, square-necked and coming to a point just below her waist, with short tight sleeves and long full skirts. But the style suited her, and Jahara wondered what the girl's life would have been like had Saravik not pursued her, had Gorion never died.
"There, what do we think?"
asked Fritha, blithely smoothing out the skirts. Jahara cast her eyes over the reflection, unable to help a smile.
"Very nice, though your chest looks a little bare."
The girl glanced down with an appraising frown, squirming as she tried to tug the bodice a touch higher.
"I didn't think it was too bad."
Jahara rolled her eyes.
"No, I mean you've no jewelry. You need some sort of pendant to break up the white of your neck." "Oh right. Well, can't be helped, my jade stone, ring, and key don't exactly suit." "Ring?"
repeated Jahara, wondering when her odd collection of pendants had increased by one.
"Yes,"
the girl confirmed as she leaned closer to the mirror and brushed some dried soap from her hairline.
"The ring of Gond I took from. Well, I went with a noman to return it to the temple yesterday and explain what had happened. They did not recognize the man I described to them, though they said they'd certainly make investigations of their own, and when I went to give them the ring they said it was not so uncommon a design and I should keep it with their blessings."
Fritha had explained it all in that very offhand way of hers that Jahara had long ago realized meant the opposite, the girl's attention now upon the counter, seemingly trying to find something in amongst the jumble of pots, vials and the small carafe of wine.
"I see,"
said the druid eventually.
"So are you going to add the Temple of the Wonderbringer to your standard tithes?"
Fritha shook her head, finally turning from the dresser with a sigh.
"I don't think Gond would be very receptive, I still owe him for that telescope." "What?"
Two sharp knocks shuttered the door behind them.
"Come in,"
they chorused, a noman stepping into the room, his eyes immediately drawn to the girl before him.
"Fritha. I scrub up all right, don't I?"
She laughed, her discomfort plain behind the hearty grin, and he wished instantly he had managed to check his admiration, his manner friendly once more as he smiled.
"I never doubted it." "Yeah,"
came cerned at the open door behind them, the man interrupting himself to add,
"Goodness, you certainly look the part, Fritha. Jahara, Mech has arrived with the servant's attire." "Good, I'll just be a moment,"
said Jahara, and just as suddenly the two druids were gone, leaving only he and Fritha. A noman suppressed a frown. He had not wanted to do this alone, he had wanted Fritha to have been with Jahara or Ari so she would not feel embarrassed or get the wrong impression, and after he had been trying so hard lately to behave as she had asked and pretend there was nothing between them. Even now, the air had taken on a certain awkwardness, Fritha immediately turning back to the dresser, the long silk skirts whispering with the movement. "So," he continued, anything to break the silence swelling between them,
"it is not long now. At what time is the coach arriving?" "Just after the 6th bells, it is collecting Higold first." I bet he is driving the troupe mad at the theater, preening and primping, having them all running about after him, not that I am in any position to criticize.
She laughed.
I am sure Higold will be very proud to have you at his arm.
ARandomAud smiled, adding hastily when he realized how such might be construed.
You are the patron of a newly flourishing theater, after all, not that you do not look nice, my lady, because, of course, you do, that color most becomes you, not that you don't look nice usually, but, well, yes.
He trailed off, feeling awkward, flushed and very foolish. Frithha had turned and was staring up at him, her look unreadable, before she was stooped over the dresser once more, the silence descending between them again, and he was struck by how quickly time was moving. Soon the coach would be there and he would have missed his chance altogether.
Frithha.
She inquired, keeping her attention firmly on the small pot she was fiddling with. ARandomAud swallowed, drawing the long narrow box from his jacket as he spoke and setting it on the counter before her.
Frithha, I have something for you. I know you have no jewellery of your own and such a gown would look strange without at least some pendant or necklace.
He finally removed the lid, hooking a finger about the thin gold chain within to hold it up before her, a sparkling teardrop of pale yellow citron, the stone freckling her face with spots of light reflected from the lamps as it twirled back and forth.
It was my sister's. Moira had lent it to a friend before she, well, I suspect it was to keep my father from selling it. The young lady returned it to me at her funeral and I should like you to wear it. I think Moira would approve.
Frithha just gazed at it, looking solemn and slightly sad.
You do not have to wear it,
he continued quickly, moving to return it to its case, but she stayed his hand.
No, I should like to. Thank you.
She moved to take the pendant from him, but he had already unfastened it, and before he could hasten to redo the clasp, she had turned and swept the curtain of hair from her neck. He placed it about her throat, taking care not to touch her as he fastened it, before stepping back a pace, and she let her hair swing down again, turning back to the mirror to see the effect. And there they stood a moment, together within the frame, she all radiance in the light of the many lamps set upon the dresser before them, him slightly behind her and cloaked in shadows, the pale yellow stone sparkling at her throat.
Right, the tunics are all in Cern's room and I've got Jenna's shoes here,
Jahara announced, the door swinging open to make them both jump.
They look a little big though, so I've stuffed the toes with parchment. And I have the combs,
came Ari behind her, a large flat box of polished wood in her hands.
Oh, thank you,
exclaimed Frithha, moving quickly to welcome them both in, and ARandomAud wondered if it was not just an excuse to move away from him. Ari smiled, handing the box to her to take a small wallet from her robes.
Annalise brought some earrings for you to try too. Oh, that's nice of her, but they'll be no good for me, I haven't had my ears pierced.
Ari seemed surprised, peering at her ears as though she doubted her word.
Truly? Yes, I was always scared it would hurt,
Frithha confessed, looking rather lost as she began to laugh shrilly. ARandomAud frowned.
Well, I shall leave you ladies to it. What? Oh, yes, thank you, ARandomAud.
Frithha called after him, the girl turning back to the dresser and setting down the box with trembling hands. Ari was frowning slightly, clearly concerned though she asked only,
that necklace, Frithha, did ARandomAud give it to you?
The girl nodded, not looking up from where she was nervously playing with one of the fragile shell combs.
Yes, he did, it was his sister's.
Jahara sent Ari a look.
Are you well, Frithha?
asked the druid, setting the black-heeled shoes upon the dresser and reaching for the carafe next to them.
Would you like some wine? Oh, gods, yes please!
Fritha cried, almost snatching the cup from her and gulping back the contents.
Steady now, you'll choke yourself.
Fritha just shook her head, the cup now empty and discarded to the dresser as she continued to chatter feverishly.
Oh, Jahara, I don't think I can do this. What? Now, where is this coming from? You have engaged in such deceptions before and quite merrily as I recall. No, not tonight.
The girl cried, almost wild.
No man. He's trying so hard, and being so kind and strange at me. Oh, stop laughing.
Fritha snapped as Ari was suddenly lost to giggling, her sharp anger clearly wasted on the elf's mirth.
I knew it. I knew you liked him.
She cried, pink in her joy.
You've liked him all this time, haven't you? Ah, how wonderful!
Fritha looked utterly appalled, her face glowing.
Shut up! I hold you entirely responsible for this palaver. Me? What did I do? If you were any sort of friend, you would have agreed to court him yourself like I suggested. You two are perfect for each other, you only deny it to put me in this situation.
Ari could make no defense to this, though her laughter was probably answer enough. Jahara sighed, fighting against a smile herself as she placed a firm hand on either shoulder and forced Fritha to look up at her.
Fritha, I know this may sound odd, but there is no weakness to loving someone,
she allowed herself a slight smile,
even a no man. Sometimes these things do not make sense. If you are finding you have feelings for him.
Fritha said nothing, just shook her head as though her voice had failed her, her face crumpling with a heart-rending misery, and Jahara gathered the girl to her, Fritha burying her face into her shoulder as she began to sob. Behind them, Ari's laughter had come to an abrupt silence.
I'll go and
The door clicked shut, leaving the two of them alone, Fritha drawing back after a moment, her voice wavering as she fought to swallow her tears.
Oh, Jahara, I've made such a mess of things. I'm trying to be strong, for you and Minsk and Imoen, but it's all so hard, and now there's a no man. I'm trying to keep him at a distance, but I'm so lonely. I know I've got you and Ari, but it's different, isn't it? Oh, Fritha, of course, it is, there now. But you just don't understand, he says things sometimes, he's so warm and
the girl dipped her head, her voice coming hoarse,
I am so cold.
Jahara gave the shoulders that still rested beneath her hands a gentle squeeze.
Then would it be so impossible to consider a relationship with him? No.
The girl cried, pulling away from her.
You know how my life is, so dangerous for everyone close to me. Galvari was right in that, at least. It would be different if I felt for a no man as he feels for me, but I know it is just because I am lonely and it's not fair on him. He deserves someone whose heart sings for him, who can look at him with that soft look, the one he wears when he looks at me.
Jahara sighed gently.
Then perhaps you should tell him that. No, I can't.
She sent the girl a measured look.
Because you don't think it would be wise, or because you're frightened? Please, Jahara,
Fritha begged, her voice breaking as tears threatened again.
Because I know he'll say he doesn't care, and it will all be horrible. Oh, I wish he had never told me. Come on, there now,
Jahara soothed, ushering the girl over to the bed and sinking down onto the covers.
Come on.
She sighed, tugging the girl's hair gently, and Fritha instinctively lay her head upon her lap, Jahara combing her fingers through the mess of curls.
It is for just a little longer, just bear it all a little longer. We will have raised enough coins soon and we will fetch Imoen, and then, and then I will return with you to Athkatla and stay with you both for as long as you have need of me."
Fritha sniffed, her voice sounding small.
"But didn't you want revenge on Irenicus?" "A part of me does, yes, but a larger part would see you and Imoen safe and settled, and I think that would be the part that Khalid would have approved of."
For a moment they were silent, the girl's head heavy in her lap.
"Oh, the sixth bells,"
came Fritha quietly, straightening and dabbing at her face with the bedclothes, trying to regain some air of the presentable as the deep chimes resonated across the city outside.
"The carriage will be arriving soon. Could you help me dress my hair please?"
Jahara smiled wry, ruffling it with a gentle hand.
"I think we both know Ari will be the one to trust for such a task. I shall go and fetch her."
Valigar rolled his shoulders, feeling constricted and ill at ease. The plain brown tunic he was wearing had been let out at the sides with inserts of a similar fabric, though it was still not quite broad enough for his back. A no-man sat across from him and looking just as uncomfortable in a tunic of olive green which did not fit and did not suit him. The air was tense, the low rumble of the crowded common room about them strident and oppressive. Cerned and Minsk sat at the same table as they, the Rashami drinking steadily while the druid at his side kept his eyes trained upon the scratched pitted wood on the table. The knight glanced up, something in the common room clearly catching the man's eye, and Valigar could make a guess at what as a no-man turned away again an instant later, the ranger glancing back to see the three women stepping from the stairwell, their cloaks over their arms. Ari looked just as she usually did, but Jahara had changed, now wearing the green skirt and pale tan blouse she had been brought from the playhouse, while Fritha was barely recognizable. Her hair was up, though only in the most tenuous sense of the word, the back of her head just a loosely gathered mess of curls that was pinned here and there with delicate tortoiseshell combs, a hand casually holding up the long green skirts of her gown as she chatted merrily with Ari, looking as easy and natural as though she wore such every day. And Valigar was not the only one to have noticed, Handak calling something to them that made the three laugh, and some people were openly staring as they crossed the tavern. An oily man sat on the table opposite, turned to give him a lecherous grin, and Valigar scowled back, feeling an angry pleasure in watching the man return hurriedly to his drink. He was not happy with their plan. The idea of letting a man such as Diril escape proper justice went against all he believed. But there had been similar clashes of viewpoints in his previous party on occasion, and he had realized long ago that in these groups of strong opinionated people such conflicts were to be expected, and he respected the decision of the majority enough to go along with it.
"Ah, young Fritha!"
exclaimed the Rashami with a genuine delight as the three women reached their table.
"Who says you look like a princess?"
The girl gave a familiar toothy grin that was quite at odds with his compliment.
"Excellent, that was just the air I was going for." "Right, are we all ready?" "We are just waiting on the carriage, my lady,"
answered a no-man,
"though other than that we are all prepared." "Well, that's fine, but for goodness sake don't say a word once we get there, a no-man." "Why ever not?" "Because I've yet to meet a servant who sounds more well-to-do than his master. Try to give your voice more of a local cadence, you know, more oh gods blind me, lord, I ain't ne'er seen such a Gatharan."
Fritha cried in an accent so broad as to be ridiculous, the ensuing laughter taking the building tensions down a notch, even a no-man managing a smile as he assured her if the situation arose he'd just mumble. A rattle outside, all heads whipping to the sound.
"That's the coach,"
said Jahara. Something confirmed, but moments later as Higold staggered through the door, the man gasping as though he had just run all the way from the bridge himself.
"There you are, my lady, sorry, I'm late. Oh, it is quite the tempest out there. I've got Ketrick driving as you asked." The driver the carriage arrived with is back in the inn taking ale with some of the cast, At the theater's expense, I should add. I do hope he slows down though, the rate he was drinking when I left. He won't be able to see straight to get home. All right, time to go,
announced Fritha, Ari stepping closer in the ensuing disorder as drinks were finished and cloaks were thrown on.
Be careful, all of you.
Fritha smiled, clapping the Rashmi at the elf's side on the arm.
Don't fret, you two, we'll be back soon enough. Right, go on, you lot, into the carriage. Higold and I will come last.
Outside the air was damp and not as cold as it could have been, a light rain carried in the intermittent breeze. A large plain black carriage stood in the street a yard or so from the door, two dappled grey horses between the shafts and old Ketrik hunched upon the driver's bench.
Yes, it is quite the maelstrom out here,
muttered Valigar to the man at his side, a noman's lips twitching as he climbed into the carriage behind him, Jahara and then Cern following them before. At last, Fritha and the still flapping Higold climbed inside, the pair nearest to the door ready for their arrival.
It's a good job I was going for that charmingly disheveled look,
Fritha sighed, patting her hair back into place and reaching up to thud the wood behind her head. A sharp snap as Ketrik whipped the reins and with a jerk they were off, the wet streets racing past the small windows as a tense silence fell over the carriage that even Higold had sense enough not to break. Tyrell's estate was across the river in the far northwest of the city, but even so it hardly seemed a moment later they were being ushered through the gates by a tall servant in a fine blue coat, an entwined pair of silver serpents embroidered upon the sleeve. The man pointed them to the procession of coaches that were queuing around the circular drive waiting to deposit their occupants at the main steps, the torches that lined the edge guttering in the breeze.
I'll leave my cloak here, it does not suit this dress,
murmured Fritha, just undoing the clasp though the fabric moved nowhere, wedged as she was between Valigar and the wall. The carriage slowly edged around the driveway before rattling to a halt at the steps, a similarly uniformed footman opening the door and lowering the step, Higold descending first and leaving it to the servant to escort Fritha down as the director gazed up at the fine stone manor before them, the many large windows glittering in the light of the torches. Other couples and groups were all about them, hands upon on hats and hair as they hurried up the steps to get inside and out of the slight breeze, the footman confirming they were staying and shouting instructions to Ketrik, Valigar unable to see their old driver though he could hear him muttering through the wood behind his head.
Round the corner on my left, you jumped up little, have yourself a good evening there, m'lady,
he shouted down to his passengers much more politely.
Yes, you too,
Fritha called back, the girl letting her eyes linger on the small carriage window and the shadowy faces still within, before turning to begin her ascent, Higold at her side, the girl having to remind the man to offer her his arm with a nudge and a hiss, though it did not look too out of place. Valigar watching a stout woman just ahead of them surreptitiously scold her broad and seemingly oblivious husband about wearing the wrong shoes. And then the scene was gone, Ketrik whipping up the horses once more and the carriage rumbled on, turning down the side of the house to eventually find a place just outside the stables next to a few other coaches. Their horses were left in the capable hands of a few stably boys, one of the young lads directing them to the other side of the stables, and they followed the neat gravel path that skirted the buildings to finally reach the back of the house where a large marquee had been placed in the grounds in anticipation of the inclement weather. The large house gave some shelter from the cool breeze though, the gathering lit by the bright windows of the nearby kitchens, a few torches set on the far side to keep the shadows at bay. A band was gathering in one corner of the dance floor. Most of the guests stood or sat on the benches that edged the dance floor chatting in twos and threes, or milling about the long table that ran along the far side of the marquee, the wood groaning under the weight of dishes and carafes, an assortment of breads, meats, cheeses, and ales provided by the kitchens.
Right,
muttered Jahara as they surveyed the crowd.
Everyone remember the plan.
And then, if suddenly recalling something herself, she glanced to the old man at her side.
Ketrik, did Higold tell you why we came here?
The old stagehand shrugged indifferently.
Nope. Don't know, and I don't care so long as I get some free ale without having to listen to that halfling talking 15 to the dozen. Just don't get drunk and mention the theater,
Jahara hissed, Ketrick waving away her warning with a gnarled hand as he watched the gathering.
Missy, hey, Anton, what you doing here, you old bastard? I thought you...
His voice was lost to the crowds. Valigar, considering the old man was doing better at blending in than they were, stood in an uncomfortable knot on the edge of the gathering. Something which had not gone unnoticed, a merry rosy-cheeked woman, her wispy blonde hair escaping from the coiled braids at her ears, nudging the tall dark-skinned man next to her, and soon the pair were heading straight for them.
"Oh, hello there,"
the woman greeted cheerily, the lines at her eyes creasing as she smiled.
"I'm Molly the cook here, and this is Crow the head gardener and my husband. I don't believe I recognize any of you though." "We are not from Ithkatla,"
said Jahara, ready with her lie.
"Our mistress is wintering in the city on business." "We've a couple here like that,"
said Crow, his accent as broad as his smile.
"Just help yourselves to food and ale. Here, this way." "Oh, I just love to meet new people,"
Molly trailed as they followed the pair awkwardly across the dance floor. Jahara, stiff as the cook, slipped a companionable arm about her elbow.
"Now, let me guess, you're a lady's maid?" "I'm right." "Oh, good, and you must be our coachman."
Cern nodded once and the woman beamed, glancing back to the remaining men as though she had not noticed them before.
"And, well, goodness, what does your lady keep you two for?"
"Guards," said Valigar curtly.
"Does she often expect trouble?" "She finds her entertainments in the rougher areas of the city."
Crow barked with laughter.
Likes slumming it, does she? Idiots nobles, what?"
he cried as his wife gave him a meaningful nudge.
They know I'm only joking, Malls. Listen, none of you play the flute, do you?" The undergardener, Dard, hurt his hand earlier, the stupid idiot, so the band's one short. "No,"
he confirmed at the four blank faces.
No matter then, have a good evening."
And the pair bustled off, leaving them at the laden table, the man's arm around his wife even as she scolded him for being too free. They stayed for about an hour, splitting up to mingle with the other servants and waiting for the final few people to arrive and the band to start up before they regrouped on the far side of the dance floor, the jig that was currently in full swing providing cover for their conversation.
"Right,"
muttered Jahara, a smile forced and manner light as she spoke.
"It should be crowded enough here now for our absence to go unnoticed. Valigar and I will slip off and walk about the house as agreed and see if we cannot locate the library while you two maintain our presence here."
A nod each from Cern and Anomen. Jahara turned, Valigar at her heels as they edged back towards the table, lingering there an instant before slipping between the two large azalea bushes behind them and turning about to come face to face with Crow bearing two large carafes, replenishments for the gathering they had just left.
"Oh, hello there,"
he greeted, Jahara trying to work out an explanation but her throat had suddenly closed.
We just off for a spot of fun, He laughed genially. "Don't blame you, though you've a cold night for it. Soon wish you joy."
And off he went, strolling back to the gathering without a backward glance. Jahara glanced to the man next to her, the ranger's eyes light with a smile, and they both shared a brief snort of laughter before they were off once more, carefully skirting the kitchens to begin their search. They circled the house, peering into the darkened windows and avoiding the lighted ones. It had been Fritha's idea, none of them knowing the layout of Dirl's property, to be able to suggest a suitable place to meet, and so the girl had suggested the library in that it was likely to be empty and Dirl was bound to have one. Now, they just had to find it. On the other side of the house, A tall stone veranda jutted out into the grounds, glass-paneled doors showing glimpses into the glittering ballroom beyond, the people inside small from that distance, a rainbow of brightly colored figures that flittered and darted behind the glass like some strange aviary. Jahara paused a moment, waiting for her eyes to catch on a blot of green or copper, but it did not happen, and she and Valigar finished their search to walk back to the servants' gathering. Cerned was sat alone, a no-man caught in conversation with the ever-cheerful Molly, though he quickly disengaged himself as he noticed their arrival, moving to join them and the druid at the edge of the table.
"We have made our search,"
began Jahara.
"The library is not situated on the ground floor."
A no-man cast an appraising glance up the building behind them.
"The second floor will likely be the servants' quarters, so the library must be on the first, probably somewhere in the core of the building near to the main staircase."
Jahara nodded.
"Valigar and I will enter through the kitchens and use the backstairs to reach the first floor, and from there we'll continue our search. I just hope Fritha takes her time."
Fritha let the brilliant chaos of color swim before her eyes, the room about her so bright as to be dazzling, lamps set against the walls at every yard, while overhead huge chandeliers cast glittering light over the confusion of colored gowns and coats. Dirl's ballroom was beautiful, but in a very lavish way, all white marble columns and heavy blue curtains, every stick of furniture in there lacquered or gilded as though the actual wood itself was not deemed fine enough alone. The musicians were taking their break, and the dance floor thronged with groups of people all talking and drinking, the ladies laughing behind their fans, seemingly ashamed to be seen so amused. Fritha sighed inwardly. She would have never thought it possible before at such a gathering, but there you had it, she was bored. She rather liked wearing the corset, it made her stand up straighter if nothing else, but Jenna's shoes were hurting her feet fiercely, the heel much higher than she was used to, and the parchment pricked with every step. Higold had left her an hour ago, continuing his search for advantageous acquaintances as he had put it, though Fritha had just remained where she was, stood against the wall and quite overlooked in the surrounding splendor. The director was not too far from her now, in fact, talking to two stout older ladies who were so covered in bows and frills and feathers she wondered how there managed to be room in their dresses for them. Fritha glanced back to the grand marble fireplace behind her and the small clock set upon the mantelpiece. It was getting on for the 10th hour now, about 3 hours into the party and half an hour past the time she had agreed to meet the others in the library, but the final part of her plan was proving to be problematic. She let her eyes scan the hall before they came to rest once more upon that familiar pale figure, the man still hale for his advanced years, Dirl standing tall and striking in a doublet of dark blue velvet as he held court within yet another group of guests. Fritha sighed, turning away once more and inadvertently catching Higold's eye, and in a moment of unprecedented chivalry he had suddenly excused himself and was crossing the room towards her, pausing only to pluck a glass of wine from a server as he passed.
"Ah, my lady,"
he sighed infatuatedly as he handed her the glass,
"I cannot thank you enough for inviting me along this evening, the people, the connections."
Fritha almost wondered if he was planning to faint from the sheer rapture of it all when he seemed to gather himself to add,
"But you do not appear to be enjoying yourself, my lady."
He cocked his head in a sympathetic look.
"Are you finding the company a little daunting?"
Fritha dipped her face to sip her wine and hid the impatient frown both.
"Not quite. I need to speak with Dirl on a private matter, but he is always surrounded by people."
Higold laughed airily.
"Well, just go over there and interrupt." "Higold, I can't just waltz over there and elbow his other guests out of the way." "Well, no, I would not suggest that,"
the director conceded, taking her arm to continue in earnest.
"But this is a ball, my lady, true civility was handed in at the door with our invitation. Look about you, everywhere people laughing at things they think are asinine and complimenting each other of clothes they would not be buried in, or taking the time to inquire about each other's insipid broods. All as fake as the plays we entertain them with.
He sighed, enraptured once more.
Ah, I love it. There now, who is Dirl engaged with now?
He continued, Fritha finding the mage in the crowd once more, now talking to a stout woman of middling years with oily black hair and a thin ungenerous mouth. At her side, Higold drew a theatrical gasp.
Oh, is that Bethseda from the Crown? How did that old cow manage to get herself an invitation? Well.
He huffed as though she had only been included as a personal insult to him.
Dirl has certainly gone down in my estimations if he is willing to request the company of that uninspired hack. Come, my lady!
He cried, linking an arm about her own and pulling Fritha with him.
I am more determined than ever you should have your meeting. Bethseda,
Higold cried, the woman turning at the noise and instantly engulfed as the director threw his arms about her and exaggeratedly kissed both cheeks.
My darling, is it you? I hardly recognize you without the grey in your hair. Oh, Bethseda, you must come and tell me all about your latest production.
And without the women even uttering a word she was being swept off by Higold, Dirl, and Fritha sharing a moment of speechless amazement as they stared after them, before both seemed to realize they had been left together. The old mage was studying her from beneath his grey fringe, though it was clear he hadn't the faintest idea whom she was, and Fritha wondered if Dirl had even seen half the invitations he had sent out. Fritha took the lead and bobbed a curtsy.
Your pardon, my lord, but I merely wished to thank you for your invitation to these grand celebrations.
He nodded his head, the slightest hint at a bow as he intoned insincerely,
Your words honor me, my dear. And yet,
she cut in hastily as he made to take his leave,
and yet I would offer you so much more than words, my lord. I believe you were once acquainted with the Corthala family, namely her ladyship, Ades Corthala. I know nothing of that name,
Dirl snapped coldly. Fritha dipped her head in mock repentance, turning to regard him knowingly as she continued,
I meant no offence, my lord, indeed, we need have no fear of the dead. But it is her very much alive son of whom I should like to speak to you. You have heard of his dislike of mages? That he recently murdered 2 cowled wizards as well as the famed necromancer, Lavak.
She had his attention now, Dirl staring down at her, pale blue eyes burning.
Who are you? A friend, my lord, and one who has it on good authority that the Corthala heir has returned to the city and with a desire to rid it of his mother's associates. I heard from the Bridge District Guards that 2 students, Roed and Stefan, have already been found dead. And how did you come by this knowledge? I am something of a student myself, my lord, though the cowled ones refuse to sponsor me. They rejected your apprenticeship, did they?
Dirl concluded curtly. Fritha dipped her head and did not correct him, saying only,
Maybe we could discuss this further, my lord, somewhere more quiet, a music room or your library perhaps.
Dirl nodded wordlessly, turning and clearly expecting her to follow, Fritha keeping her face dipped against the smile as she placed a hand at her skirts and tripped lightly after him. A no-man retook his seat on the bench next to Cernd, the young maid who he had been dancing with, returning to her small knot of friends on the other side of the floor for them all to enjoy a shrill giggle, the knight just managing to suppress an eye roll as he turned to the druid at his side.
How long has it been now? Too long,
the druid answered curtly, continuing with a nod to the dark-haired maid who was still trying to make eyes at a no-man.
Should you have been speaking with her? You heard our mistress, your song marks you as an outsider to the other birds here. The girl spoke to me and asked me to dance, I could hardly ignore her.
Cernd sighed into the ale cup he had been holding since they arrived.
How quickly the plover forgets his chosen suit when a new potential mate preens her plumage for him,
Anomen frowned, the man's antagonism unusual enough to raise his concern rather than his temper.
I do not know why you are trying to draw out my ire, Cerned, but I would ask that you cease.
The druid sighed again, stooping to set his cup down on the grass at their feet and remaining hunched as he rested his head in his hands.
I am sorry, Anomen, Have you ever been presented with something you both desire and fear in the same instance?
Anomen swallowed as he was given a glimpse of a feeling he had once been so infused with, the desperate longing to join the order coupled with the fear to try and face the unbearable shame as he was denied their ranks.
The order,
he admitted after a pause,
I wished to join but I feared I was not worthy. And what if?
Cerned pressed, suddenly turning to face him, the desperation plain on his face.
What if joining the order had terrible repercussions elsewhere, upon someone else? I don't really understand. That what you desire could be someone else's ruin until you are no longer sure of what you want? Asdale is happy here. He does not know of me or likely recalls his mother, how can I take him from all he knows?
Anomen shook his head, hardly able to believe what he was hearing. I know this may not be the most supportive stance to take, Cerned, but now is not the time for you to be having misgivings. If you no longer wish to pursue this plan.
You do not understand,
the druid cried.
You think this some simple decision for me? The longing to have Asdale with me, it is like the sky or the sea, a great endless expanse of feeling. But at the same time such fear. You know what I am, Dirl should not be the one to raise him, but does that mean I should? It is like being back in the promenade, in that life in the pottery where I was two men being torn apart by my conflicting desires.
The knight sucked in a terse breath. They did not have time for this. Anomen took Cerned firmly by the shoulders to ask again,
do you wish to abandon the plan? Say now and I will march inside, fetch Fritha, and we will all leave, but you must say now.
Cern seemed to falter a moment before he hung his head.
I would continue. We have found it,
came a voice, Jahara appearing behind their bench.
Valigar is there now, what is going on? Nothing,
sighed Cerned, shrugging Anomen off as he turned to her.
You say you have found the library? Yes, we just need an opportunity for us all to slip away and...
Laughter cut her off. A young lad who was well into his cups had climbed up and was dancing on the end of the table, Kroll laughing along with the others while Molly tugged at her husband's sleeve, scolding him and the boy both. Jahara sighed.
I imagine that will do, come on.
Dirl had stepped back to let her enter first, Fritha moving into the darkened room, her eyes immediately drawn to the high ceiling and the huge window of rain-speckled glass that opened out onto the clouded sky, casting all but the edges of that cavernous room in a pale ghostly light. What little she could see of the walls were filled floor to ceiling with bookcases, a narrow balcony set halfway up, convenient ladders placed at regular intervals.
Your library is beautiful,
Fritha sighed quite sincerely.
I am glad you think so,
came his voice behind her, warmed with a conceited smile,
especially since it will be the last thing you see.
Fritha whirled back with a sharp gasp, the old man before her seeming so much taller than before, a thin curved dagger suddenly clutched in his long skeletal fingers.
But I came here to help you,
she cried, slowly backing away from him.
I have information. Yes, a little too much, I fear. I thank you for the warning about the Korthala whelp though, I will be sure to take additional precautions from now on, perhaps even arrange for him to meet with an accident. Do not worry, my dear, remember, we have nothing to fear from death. I'll scream,
she squeaked. Dirrell smiled, his gaunt face just a leering white skull in the gloom.
I would hope so, though there will be no one to hear you.
Frithla grinned.
Excellent.
And she watched with a cruel delight the slow transition from triumph to dread play out upon the old mage's face as the point of that fine katana came to rest between his shoulders and Baldur rumbled, "Drop the knife." The blade hit the carpeted floor with a dull thud, Dirrell's breathing deepening as two more emerged from the shadows either side of him, a gnome stooping to retrieve the knife as Jaehaera moved to join the girl before him, Frithla clapping her hands delightedly.
Oh, I love it when a plan comes together. How was I? Did I overact it? You were the epitome of the distressed heroine,
assured Jaehaera with a wry amusement.
Oh, thank you. Who are you all?
Snapped Dirrell, this irreverence seeming to annoy him more than their trap.
I demand. The time for your demands is over, Dirrell,
came that eerily mellow voice, Cern finally stepping from the darkness at the back of the room to face him. Dirrell managed the impossible as he became even whiter.
You again? I warned you before, the child is my kin now. You have no claim to him. He is my son,
said Cern simply.
No, he was Gallia's son. She is dead and now he is mine. And how did she die, Dirrell?
The druid pressed, advancing slowly into the room.
Because we have evidence that may suggest her end was not natural.
The old mage snorted.
You have no evidence of that sort, and so I freely admit it was by my hand the killing blow was dealt. You murdered her!
Roared Cern, Jaehaera and Frithla sharing a wary glance as Dirrell gravely shook his head.
No, I believe that honor belongs to you. Everything that Gallia was died when you left, Cern, I merely finished the thing. A little hemlock slipped into her wine, she would have felt no pain. I believe it was a mercy in the end. Foolish woman, I would not have killed her at all but for her refusal to let me adopt Asdale. She would always maintain that you were the father and that however you had neglected them, she could not rob you of that right. Such a noble soul!
He sneered, his contempt obvious.
You understand, I expect much better from Asdale. Silence!
Barked Cern, the man beginning to tremble. Jaehaera took a step back, eyes never leaving the mage even as she placed a hand upon the druid's arm.
Do not bait him, Dirrell, or you will be more sorry than you can imagine.
Frithla nodded, smoothing her lips together as she made to play her hand.
You're right, Dirrell, we don't have evidence you murdered your wife, but we do have plenty of proof that links you to two grave robbers who were murdering people about the city in order to supply your need for corpses. Now, I will admit it is not enough for the magistrates, but for the people of Athkatla.
She trailed off, letting the implications of her threat take root before continuing casually.
Besides, we only really have to prove you're a necromancer. Did I introduce you to Baldur here? I believe you moved in the same circles as his mother for a time, we have evidence of that too.
Frithla smiled, cocking her head playfully to one side as she considered.
I wonder how busy your gathering would be next year, if all the other noble houses were to hear rumors of your rather unsavory practices. Oh, I doubt they'd really care, but they would have to be seen to disapprove. It's all about keeping up appearances after all. But then, would the cowled wizards be so indulgent of your studies if your name did not carry the weight it does now?
Dirrell's nostrils twitched, but other than that there was no sign of emotion on that pale skull of a face.
What do you want? Asdale and no repercussions,
said Cern hoarsely. Frithla nodded.
And then you will never hear from us again, you have my word.
The two men stared at each other, eyes locked in a cold hatred when at last Dirrell turned, Baldur following him over to a bell pull just beside the door. Dirl gave it a single sharp tug, time flowing slowly by before a polite knock at the door broke the silence and the mage opened it on a young maid, Valigar poised just behind the door, blade ready for any betrayal.
You rang, my lord. Edith, bring Asdale here at once and tell his nurse her services are no longer required, she is to leave first thing tomorrow.
If the girl thought anything odd in his orders she did not show it, and Fritha considered that perhaps staff that asked questions did not last long in Dirl's service. An agonizing few minutes of waiting and the knock came again, Dirl opening the door and taking the blanket-wrapped bundle from the girl.
Thank you. Now get back to the party.
He dismissed, the girl just bobbing another curtsy and pulling closed the door. Dirl turned back into the room, the old mage jogging the sleepy child as he began to whimper, his voice strangely tender as he soothed,
Come now, Asdale, do not fret. There.
Dirl continued, the chill back to his voice as he thrust the boy at Jahara.
Now take him and go.
Jahara was already heading for the door, Cern just behind her as Valigar stood with katana aloft, guarding their retreat though Dirl was not even watching them, the mage walking slowly away from them, further into his library to be lost in the shadows. They left the library at a jog, hurrying after Valigar along corridors and down the back stairs, the way thankfully free of servants, the group finally crossing the kitchens and they were back in the darkness of the grounds. Outside, the wind had picked up and the rain was heavier for it though the servants' gathering was still going strong, the sound of music and laughter echoing over the grounds. The others headed straight back to the coach, a no-man returning briefly to the party to collect their driver, Ketrick thankfully still quite sober and more than happy to be heading home for the evening.
Right, are we all in?
Asked the old stagehand as he clambered up onto the driver's bench, though it was more to chivvy them along than any real question. Half their group still stood before the carriage door and hurrying to get inside, no one willing to linger and tempt Dirl to a change of heart.
And where's Higold?
Continued Ketrick as he scanned his remaining passengers with a frown.
He's walking back,
laughed Fritha, waiting as Jahara passed Asdale to someone inside the coach before the druid climbed in herself, Valigar following her. Fritha stood at the open door as she made the last of her orders.
Right, that's your lot, Ketrick. Take them back to the coronet and then get yourself back to the flagons. I'll collect Higold and walk him back to the theatre before joining you. Gods, throw me my cloak will you, it's perishing out here.
A no-man said nothing, but made no move to join them in the carriage and Jahara assumed he would be escorting her. Valigar glanced up at the house next to them, his face grave.
And so Dirl goes free. For the moment, at least, said Fritha the girl rooting in her cloak pocket before leaning up to pass him the 2 rings and Dirl's folded list. A no-man watched the exchange with a frown. But, my lady, you gave Dirl your word. Yes, well, that's me headed straight to Carceri,
Fritha accepted with a laugh and a sigh.
Besides, Valigar made him no promise. Though you had best get enough evidence to have him at least sent to Mashtika.
She continued to the ranger,
because I do not want to add undead hordes to the current list, those out for my blood.
For the first time in her memory, Valigar laughed warmly. End of chapter.